In the black water of the Pacific, a destroyer is not supposed to survive alone. It is smaller than a cruiser, weaker than a battleship, less glamorous than an aircraft carrier, but when torpedoes are in the water, bombers are diving from the clouds, submarines are hunting below, and missiles are screaming over the horizon. The destroyer is often the first ship to react and the last ship to quit. For more than a century, U.S. Navy destroyers have done the dirty work of sea power. They escorted convoys through submarine-infested waters. They charged into night battles where the enemy was barely visible. They rescued pilots, screened carriers, fired missiles, hunted submarines, and sometimes took damage that should have killed them. But not every destroyer class was equal. Some were rushed into service and became obsolete almost as soon as they arrived. Some were reliable workhorses that carried the fleet through war. Some changed naval warfare forever. And a few became so powerful that calling them destroyers almost feels unfair. Today we are ranking the major U.S. destroyer classes from worst to best, not by looks, not by hype, but by combat value, reliability, innovation, numbers built, and long-term impact. And number one might be obvious, but the reason it wins is bigger than firepower. Let's begin at the bottom. At number 10 are the famous four stackers, especially the Wicks and Clemson classes. Now, calling them the worst does not mean they were useless. These ships were products of urgency. The United States needed destroyers fast during World War I, and these long, narrow, four-funnel ships were built in huge numbers. They were fast for their time and useful as convoy escorts, patrol ships, and later as training vessels, mine layers, seaplane tenders, and even converted transports. But as destroyers, they aged quickly. Their range was limited. Their seakeeping could be rough. Their early anti-aircraft and anti-submarine systems were primitive compared with what would come later. By World War II, many were already old ships forced into a new kind of war. Some fought bravely, and some became legends through sacrifice. But as a class, they represent the awkward early stage of American destroyer design. Fast, numerous, necessary, but far from ideal. They were the foundation, but foundations are not always masterpieces. At number 9 are the interwar destroyer classes, ships like Mahan, Gridley, Bagley, Benham, Sims, Porter, and Summers. These destroyers were not failures. In fact, many fought hard in World War II. They were faster, better armed, and more modern than the four stackers, but they also show the problem of designing warships in peacetime, when no one fully knows what the next war will demand. Some carried heavy torpedo batteries, some pushed speed, some experimented with different machinery and layouts, but many were cramped, top-heavy, or limited in growth potential. When World War II arrived, destroyers needed more radar, more anti-aircraft guns, more sonar, more depth charges, and more command equipment. The interwar ships had to absorb all of that weight, and not all of them handled it well. They were brave ships, but transitional ships. They helped the Navy learn what a modern destroyer needed to be. And that lesson would soon create far better designs. At number 8, Benson and Gleaves. These were the bridge between the experimental destroyers of the 1930s and the great wartime destroyers of the 1940s. They were more balanced than many earlier designs. They served across the Atlantic and Pacific. They escorted convoys, fought submarines, screened larger fleets, and supported amphibious landings. Their value was not glamour. Their value was usefulness. But compared to the destroyer classes that followed, they were smaller and had less margin for growth. As anti-aircraft weapons and radar became more important, the Navy needed destroyers with more space, more endurance, and more stability. So the Benson and Gleaves classes deserve respect. They did the job when the Navy needed them, but they were not the final answer. They were the last step before the U.S. Navy found its destroyer formula. At number 7, Forrest Sherman. After World War II, the U.S. Navy had hundreds of destroyers, but the jet age, nuclear submarines, and guided missiles were changing everything. The Forrest Sherman class was America's last major all-gun destroyer design. On paper, these ships looked like classic destroyers refined to a high level. Modern sensors, strong guns, and better post-war systems. They were clean, capable, and professional-looking ships, but history moved too fast. Missiles were arriving, submarines were getting faster and quieter, air threats were becoming more dangerous. A destroyer built mainly around guns was suddenly living in a missile world. Some Forrest Sherman ships were later modified and they served useful careers, but their basic concept was already being overtaken. They were good ships, but born at the edge of a revolution. And in naval history, timing can be just as important as design.
The USS Charles F. Adams, designated DDG-2, on September 8, 1959.
At number 6, Charles F. Adams. This class deserves more attention than it gets. The Charles F. Adams class was one of the Navy's first true guided missile destroyer designs. Instead of simply adding missiles to an old concept, these ships represented a serious move into the missile age. They carried surface-to-air missiles, guns, anti-submarine weapons, and sensors that made them valuable escorts for carrier groups and task forces. In the Cold War, that mattered. The threat was no longer just a torpedo boat or a dive bomber. It was high-speed aircraft, submarines, and missiles. Destroyers had to defend not just themselves, but the fleet around them. The Adams class helped define that mission. So why not higher? Because they were still steam-powered ships from an earlier engineering generation. Later destroyers would gain gas turbines, vertical launch systems, better computers, better radars, and much more flexible missile loads. The Adams class was a milestone, but not the peak. It was the door opening into modern destroyer warfare. At number 5, Spruance. When the Spruance class appeared, some critics complained that these ships looked underarmed for their size. They were large destroyers, but early versions did not carry the kind of visible missile firepower people expected. But that criticism missed the bigger picture. Spruance was built around endurance, anti-submarine warfare, aviation facilities, growth space, and gas turbine propulsion. These ships were quiet, long-legged, and well-suited to hunting submarines with helicopters and sensors. And over time, the class proved flexible. Many Spruance destroyers received upgrades, including vertical launch systems, giving them a much stronger strike role. This is why Spruance ranks high. It was not just a destroyer class, it was a platform. Its hull and machinery influenced later ships, including the Kidd-class destroyers and the Ticonderoga-class cruisers. It may not have looked terrifying at first glance, but Spruance was a turning point in how the U.S. Navy built modern surface combatants. It was big, adaptable, and ahead of its time.
Navy mobilized its largest ship, a Kidd-class destroyer, which departed Chijing at 3 in the afternoon.
At number 4, Kidd. The Kidd class is one of the most interesting destroyer stories in U.S. Navy history. Originally ordered for Iran before the 1979 revolution, these ships ended up in the U.S. Navy. Based on the Spruance hull, they were more heavily focused on air defense and multi-mission capability. In simple terms, imagine taking the strong Spruance platform and giving it more combat punch. That made the Kidd class extremely capable. They had better air defense systems than the original Spruance ships and were well suited for high-threat environments. So why are they not in the top 3? Numbers. Only 4 were built for the U.S. Navy. That limits their historical impact. A class can be excellent, but if it exists in tiny numbers, it cannot shape the fleet the way a larger class can. The Kidds were powerful, respected, and effective, but they were more like a rare elite unit than the backbone of American sea power.
Seawater rolls down the stacks, but the destroyer can take it. And so can the destroyer-man.
At number 3, we combine 2 closely related late war giants, Allen M. Sumner and Gearing. These classes took the lessons of Fletcher and pushed them further. The Allen M. Sumner class introduced a heavier gun arrangement with twin 5-inch mounts, giving more firepower in a compact hull. The Gearing class stretched the design, improving endurance and making the ships more useful for the vast Pacific. These destroyers arrived late in World War II, but their careers lasted far beyond it. They served through the Cold War. Many were modernized for anti-submarine warfare. Some went to Allied navies and remained in service for decades. That longevity says something important. The design had strength. These ships were not just wartime emergency vessels. They were adaptable enough to survive into the missile and submarine age, but they still sit behind one World War II class because that class arrived earlier, fought everywhere, and became the destroyer by which others were judged.
The Fletcher-class destroyer would turn out to be the staple of US destroyers in the Second World War.
At number 2, Fletcher. If this ranking were only about World War II, Fletcher might be number 1. The Fletcher class was arguably the classic American destroyer, big enough to carry serious weapons, fast enough to keep up with the fleet, tough enough to take punishment, flexible enough to handle guns, torpedoes, anti-aircraft defense, anti-submarine work, radar, rescue missions, and shore bombardment. The U.S. Navy built 175 Fletcher-class destroyers, more than any other American destroyer class. And they were everywhere. In the Solomons, off the Philippines, at Okinawa, around carriers, near invasion beaches, in night battles, in kamikaze attacks, in the brutal places where destroyers had to fight close to danger. Fletchers were not perfect. No destroyer was. They could be overloaded. As more anti-aircraft weapons were added, they still belonged to the gun and torpedo age, but their balance was extraordinary. They became the symbol of the World War II U.S. destroyer. Fast, aggressive, survivable, and always in the fight. The Fletcher class did not just serve the fleet. It carried the fleet through some of the hardest naval battles in history. So why is it not number 1? Because number 1 did something no other destroyer class has done. It became the backbone of American naval power for the missile age. At number 1, Arleigh Burke. The Arleigh Burke class is not just the best U.S. destroyer class. It may be one of the most successful surface warship designs of the modern era. Commissioned beginning in the early 1990s, the Burkes were built around the Aegis combat system, a powerful combination of radar, computers, weapons control, and missiles designed to track and fight multiple threats at once. These ships can defend against aircraft, hunt submarines, attack surface targets, launch land attack cruise missiles, escort carriers, conduct ballistic missile defense, operate independently, and serve as command and control platforms in complex operations. That flexibility is the reason they dominate this ranking. The Burke class has evolved through multiple flights from early ships to Flight 2A, and now Flight 3 with major radar and combat system improvements. Unlike the Zumwalt, the Burke did not become a tiny experimental class. Unlike the Kidd, it was not limited to 4 ships. Unlike the Fletcher, it did not belong to one war. The Arleigh Burke class became a long-running, constantly upgraded destroyer family that remains central to the U.S. Navy operations today. It is not the biggest destroyer. It is not the strangest. It is not the most futuristic looking, but it is proven, numerous, upgradable, heavily armed, and globally deployed. That is what makes a destroyer great. Now, we need to talk about the most controversial destroyer, Zumwalt. If we ranked by technology alone, Zumwalt would be near the top. It is enormous, stealthy, electrically advanced, and designed with room for future weapons and sensors. But ranking warships is not only about potential. The Zumwalt program was originally planned as a much larger class, but only 3 ships were built. Its advanced gun system lost its original ammunition solution. Costs rose. The mission changed. That makes Zumwalt difficult to rank. As a technology demonstrator, it is fascinating. As a future hypersonic missile platform, It may become much more important, but as a destroyer class with broad fleet impact, it has not yet matched Fletcher, Spruance, or Burke. So in this ranking, Zumwalt sits outside the top tier, brilliant, powerful, but limited by cost, numbers, and unfinished promise. So what makes a destroyer great? Not just speed, not just missiles, not just stealth. The best destroyer is the one that shows up everywhere, adapts to everything, and keeps fighting when the ocean becomes chaos. The Four Stackers began the story. The interwar ships taught hard lessons. The Fletchers became legends. The Spruance and Kidd classes helped shape the modern fleet. Zumwalt showed what the future might look like, but the Arleigh Burke class became the destroyer that carried American sea power from the Cold War into the 21st century. And that is why, from worst to best, Burke stands at the top. Because in the end, the greatest destroyer is not the one that looks most futuristic. It is the one the fleet cannot live without. Which U.S. destroyer class do you think deserves number one, Fletcher, Burke, or Zumwalt? Comment below.